refugees from Cox's Bazar camp. Again, we're almost end of the section, but I want to really thank the government, the organizers, respected members here in the room. This is the first time in history that the Rohingya get to sit in person with the host government of Bangladesh. And this is the first time have happened in history of refugees being hosted in the country. Myself, when I was in the camps for over 6 years as a refugee, I have gone through this practically. So I don't have to go back to the history or the long history that my colleague have already spoken about. You understand the refugee life because we're here, and we know there's complex situations in Myanmar as well, and not the right time for us to talk about repatriation. To me, as someone who is coming from the ground, having spent many years in Cox's Bazar and now part of diaspora, it sounds like very complicated when we talk just about the repatriation. Think through inside the country. There are so many steps to get us started with before we talk about the final stage of repatriation for the millions of refugees to return from Cox's Bazar to Myanmar. There are internally displaced people in our own country, being kept away, isolated somewhere. And in our own country, the humanitarian organizations, donors, INGOs, are not allowed to operate or deliver humanitarian aids in the country. And people are starving, no water, no food. And someday they just got forced to leave their homes and hide somewhere else. And it continues. It didn't stop, it didn't finish. And we have seen tens of thousands of refugees have again arrived in Cox's Bazar, rejoined their families, existing families, especially starting from 4th of August last year until today. And it continues to happen, and there's no end of genocide. It not only happened in 2017, the government of Bangladesh and the host community have been allowing Rohingya to shelter in their land for more than decades now. It's not only 7 years, it's not only 8 years, it's been decades and decades long. And we still have refugees in Kutupalong who are called the registered refugee who have been here since the 90s or even earlier. So I think it is time for us to think beyond the repatriation, beyond the refugee life. Where do I start actually? That's the first question to ask. Where do we start the repatriation? It has to start from Myanmar, not from Bangladesh again. Because the home is Myanmar, and that's where the solution should come from. We need to see the IDPs, internally displaced people, are able to return to their homes safely without any restrictions. We should be able to see the donors, humanitarian organizations are able to provide humanitarian assistance inside the country to improve the condition and situation for the remaining members of the community. So that will, these two steps actually, will convince the refugees in Cox's Bazar to return back to home. And that's the first thing, whoever the authority of the land, it could be Arkan Army, could be military, these are the two first steps to do for them to gain trust and for us to rebuild the trust again, and for us to be able to convince and return back to home. Before you talk about the repatriation, justice and accountability, whole list actually. I can keep going and going. What are the needs? But the very first steps is to happen inside the country, and then talk about the justice and accountability for refugees in Bangladesh. And again, not to forget, we had repatriation in the past. My grandma, for example, who is still alive, these are third times as refugees in Cox's Bazar. She was here as a refugee twice when she was herself a kid. And she was sent back to Myanmar, and I was born in 2003, and when I was only 14, together we fled again. So these are third times in the same country, in the same case as a refugee, and she's still alive. So I fear that she will die in a refugee life. She has never been a resident of a country, never been a resident of a citizen of a country. So it is just one of the many examples. So this time is not just about asking or calling for repatriation. The question is, who will be responsible after our repatriation for the human rights violation that we will go through? So we don't have to be back and forth. I don't want to see personally refugees to return back to Myanmar and start rebuilding our life after decades long, who will again become refugees in Bangladesh. I don't want to see that happen again. So to make sure it is sustainable, voluntarily, dignified, and permanent, there are a lot of steps to get us started and to begin with before we talk about just sending people from Cox's Bazar to Myanmar. Because we have had people that went back, but then they're again back here. They're again refugees here. So we don't want to see that to continue that. And again, it is a huge burden on Bangladesh as well, especially with the funding cuts. In last March, when I was here, WFP, the World Food Program, was expecting the funding cuts to go down from $12 to $6. And if that happened, for example, because the announcement were already out, that would be end of the conversation. Forget about democracy, human rights, politics, or even an inclusive representation in the camps. That would be end of the conversation. If people are starving in the camps, have no food, no meals to survive, and forget about the other things that we have in the list, the millions of problems that we talk about. The ultimate goal for us is to return back to home. And the home is in Myanmar. And that's where the solution should start from. But sadly, our community members are spread almost in all over the world. As one of our colleagues have mentioned, we have refugees almost in everywhere. And the largest populations are in Cox's Bazar, that's true. So how do we get connected and go back together again? It's a very complicated question. But then the main answer is for us not to forget, we need both. And a medium-term solution and a long-term solution as well for refugees. A medium-term is, since we don't have a deadline for repatriation, you and I, we don't know when it's going to happen. It might take a year, it might take a month, it might even happen tomorrow or maybe tonight. So since we don't have a deadline for repatriation, we need to make sure refugees have enough sufficient funding to survive in the camps. We need to make sure protections are secured, there's enough security, and refugees are not being trafficked or kidnapped to neighboring countries, to other countries, for example. And when the food cuts happened in the past, we have seen hundreds of, tens of thousands of refugees have risked themselves on a tiny boat for weeks to neighboring countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. And if that goes down to $6, starting from January, since we don't have any donors community yet, and that will be even worse than that, whatever we have experienced in the past already. So again, the few recommendations from what we have already heard from our colleagues in the community, some of those stories actually make me cry. And it's hard for our community members to go back again to what we have already experienced, to what we have already gone through. And it's not an easy thing to repeat over and over again. So I call on each and every one of you in the room, embassies, donors, respected members, host government, host community. And again, I appreciate for everything you have so far done and still continue to do, but this is not end of the conversation. This is not end of the world. And we need to make sure refugees, the people who are responsible for the human rights violations are being held accountable, and make sure refugees are in the table for continuation, for continued dialogue like this. And I'm so grateful, again, to the government. This is first time happened, but this is not the last one. It should continue like this in the future as well, until there's a sustainable solution for the refugees and the Rohingya as a whole in Myanmar. I know you all are almost upset and boring, but the fun thing is, when I was a kid here as a refugee, the only food I loved was the spicy fuskas. I really hope, I highly recommend that to all of you. And I hope you all get to try this before you leave the town. Thank you.
Again.